Supervisors Development Program. My name is Sara, Redman, and it's a pleasure to take you through this communication module. I'd like to ask you to refer to your Supervisor Development Program handbook, and specifically the communication module, which is what I'll be taking you through on this video. So why are we working through the Supervisors Development Program? Well, basically, we want to support you in your role in frontline management, wherever that might be. It might be in an office-based environment, it might be in an outdoor-based environment, it could be anywhere within an organization. But the key is that you're acting as a supervisor and you're leading a team of people and you're using your communication skills and a number of other leadership skills quite regularly. And this program will help you improve your capacity to lead and support your team, and to improve the effectiveness that you can achieve as a team. Why communication first? Communication is often one of the most challenging areas in an organization, particularly the larger an organization gets, to manage well and to do effectively. And everyone, no matter how good a communicator they may be, can benefit from increasing their communication capacity and skills. So we're starting with communication as a foundation of leadership and as a foundation of the way that we work with people. How we're going to work through this video is you will have your handbook at your side, and I will actually take you through the handbook and pause the video at various points for you to stop and actually work through. It might be a self-assessment, it might be a question and answer scenario, etc. And then you can come back on and start the video again and continue on to the next exercise in the manual. So the first step that we're going to take is we're going to actually get you to do a self-assessment. So we're going to start exactly where you are right now as you see it in terms of your communication. So I want you to grab the communication self-assessment document. It's got a number of questions on there that you just need to circle yes or no to. Just want you to take a few minutes now to work through that and just answer it as quickly and as honestly as you can. Don't take too much time over it. Just give your first response to each question, and when you've finished the assessment document, come back to the video and I'll take you through your results. Welcome back. By now you would have completed your communication self-assessment document. And don't be surprised, I'm sure that all of you would have had some questions that you answered no to. I'd be surprised if anyone could answer yes to all those questions. And accepting that they are a matter of degree. So in some circumstances, for example, you may act defensively, but you typically may not act defensively. So you may have chosen yes or no, for example, in that case, and that's fine. The key is that you've just deepened your awareness of areas that you could improve around your communication. And as I mentioned before, everyone can improve their communication. So having identified some of those areas that came up as no for you, that will help you understand what some of the key areas we're going to focus on in the program will be. And the program that we're working through with you on the video today and with the handbook, you will also be able to work directly with a coach one-on-one, where that coach will actually look at this self-assessment document that you've done and look at the work that you've done in the workbook and help you identify a plan of action that will support growth in particular areas for you in relation to communication. So hang on to the assessment. There are further blank assessments at the back of your workbook as well that you can use at any time to check in with how you're going with your coach and to check in down the track with your progress. So well done for taking the first step. Moving to your handbook, let's start on page 2 at the introduction about why do I need to improve my communication. And as we mentioned, communication covers a lot of different areas and it's a very broad topic and there's lots of different skill sets within the communication umbrella. But it doesn't matter how much you do things like work on your active listening or improve your capacity to have a difficult conversation if you don't have good relationships with the people that you work most closely with in the organization. So we're actually going to start by getting you to have a really good look at the key relationships you have at work and if they could be better and how perhaps you could improve them. I'm going to draw your attention now to page 4 and 5 in the communication module workbook, and I'm going to take you through that and then ask you to work through it on your own. So on page 4 and 5, what we're looking at there in more detail is the actual relationships that are important to you and that you need to foster to perform your job at the highest level. So at the top of page 4, there's a diagram of you, a stick figure, with a number of bubbles around. And that's where you can actually note down the key relationships that you currently have within your organization. And I imagine that that would include, at a minimum, your direct supervisor, so the person you report to, as well as members of your team. But there may also be peers that you work alongside of that are key people that you need to have a high quality relationship with to get your job done effectively and to achieve the results for your organization. So I want you to think about who you're going to put in those bubbles and take some time to actually fill that out. Once you've done that, I want you to list by name the top 3 people out of potentially 5 or 10 people that you may have put in those bubbles above. And then just right below that, there's a list where you can put in 3 key people who are most important for you in achieving your objectives at work. I then want you to think about, for those 3 key people, how effective your relationship is with each one of them, and score them. And there's a scoring system, very simple: poor, satisfactory, or very good. And I want you to put a score next to each one of those 3 names. And then there's a couple of questions below that on page 4 I want you to answer about the nature of those relationships, and specifically how much easier would your job be if each of your top 3 was very good or at least satisfactory, and that's assuming that they may not be already. The reason we're asking you that question is we want you to understand the benefits of improving your communication and your relationships with these key people to get your work done, and also for the enjoyment factor in your work. If you turn over to page 5 on the back, there's an opportunity and a fair bit of space for you to record some more detail around your relationships. So specifically looking at responsibility levels, at expectations, and at performance standards. And I want you to think about, with each of those 3 key people that you've listed on page 4, are those things clearly defined for you? So the responsibility levels, for example, that you have with your supervisor, who you directly report to, are the responsibility levels clearly defined? The expectations and the performance standards. Think also about the people that directly report to you. And do you feel that all those things, responsibility levels, expectations and performance standards, are clearly defined for them? And using relevant examples of those relationships, just look at how you can improve in each of those spaces. So how you could improve with responsibility levels with your direct reports or someone you report to, or even a peer. And the same with expectations and performance standards. So I want you to have a think about that. It might take a few minutes, but come to a place where you have some specific examples under each of those areas. I'm going to pause the video now so you can complete page 4 and 5, and then come back once you're done. Welcome back, and by now you've completed page 4 and 5, and congratulations, because it does take a lot of brain power to think these things through and note down your initial thoughts. I want to draw your attention to page 6, which is all about relationships planning. And there's a fair bit of space here for you to start to record how you could actually take action to improve your relationship with those 3 key people. And I don't necessarily expect that you'd have a clear sense of what action you could take, but if you do, I encourage you to take some time now just to record those actions down. And if you don't have a lot of clarity around it, that's equally fine, because this will be something you can work through with your coach one-on-one to identify what you actually can do to build those relationships and to help move them forward. Hello again. We're now going to work through page 7 to 10, and this is all on giving effective feedback. And I'll ask you just to start by referring to page 7, where there's just a bit of a blurb there on feedback and how it can be a very powerful motivator. And I just want you to pause and reflect on how much feedback matters to you and how it feels for you when you receive feedback from your supervisor or from peers, And distinguish how it feels, of course, when you get positive feedback, like recognition or acknowledgement from a job well done, as opposed to when you get constructive feedback. And think about when you do receive constructive feedback, when it's a critique of what you could have done better perhaps, how that can be given to you in a very skillful way where you can embrace it and move forward positively, or when it can be given to you in a way that can perhaps be more hurtful or more ineffective. And I just want you to think about that, because that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about your capacity to pass on that feedback to other people, particularly as a supervisor and as a leader in the work you're doing. So while most or all of feedback is often negative, and this is typical of a lot of organizations that we worked with, we need to understand that that actually creates a certain feeling for your staff and your team. So again, reflecting on how it feels for you, if you're consistently receiving feedback about things that you haven't done well or could have done better, you do certainly get very clear on what you shouldn't be doing, but it doesn't help you clarify what your employer really wants you to be doing or what you could be doing to be improving in your role. So it's very important to get that balance with feedback. So thinking about what kind of feedback you're typically giving to your team is a really important step here. Another big mistake that organizations often make is to not give feedback, and particularly constructive feedback or important feedback for behavior change, not to give that until a performance review. So maybe save up a whole bunch of feedback around particular behaviors that need to change, and then just have a one-off meeting with an employee and give them all that feedback at once, which is obviously not an ideal way of doing it, but it does happen consistently. Why does that happen? Because people find it hard to give feedback that's constructive sometimes. They feel that it's a difficult message to relay. They're concerned about how an individual might receive it. And so there is a real skill involved in giving that feedback, and this part of the module will help you get better at that, because again, we can all improve in this space. So on that, I want to move to a scenario just so we can get into an example and have a look at that and see what can be done with that example to improve capacity to give feedback. So I'm just going to simply read it through to you. It's on page 8, and it's about someone named John. John has worked for ABC Construction for 13 years. He's about to have his once-a-year performance review with his supervisor, Susie. This is the only chance he gets to hear about his performance. Susie takes this opportunity to bring out a folder as thick as an encyclopedia that details each of the mistakes, whether small or large, that John has made over the past 12 months. Some of the larger mistakes John was aware of, but there are some mentioned that he had no idea about until this review. With all this paperwork stacked up against him, it would be hard to convince John's supervisor that he deserves a pay increase. When Susie starts working through the list of mistakes, John gets defensive. He demands to know why these issues weren't addressed before the review, and why they had to wait until now. John said that most of the problems could have been fixed with a short 5-minute conversation at the time of the incident, rather than letting him continue to make the mistakes over and over again until the review. The review ends on a sour note, not surprisingly, with John claiming he's too scared to try anything new, and that he won't be going to Susie with any suggestions if this is the way she deals with people. So there's a scenario, and it probably seems a bit over the top, but it is amazing how often these kind of scenarios do actually eventuate in the workplace. I just want you to think about how this could have been handled better. What could have been done differently to avoid this sort of sour experience for John and ultimately for Susie, because I'd suggest it wasn't a good experience for her either. And if you're not sure on what could be done differently here to improve it, it's really, it'll be useful to take you through some feedback principles that we have on the next page to think about how you can best capture, I've got to start that bit again, that was really bad. I'm just going to end with, you don't have to go back to that slide, but I'm just going to talk about how this could be handled better, because I felt like I was going a bit there. So having read through that scenario now, I want you to think about what's in your mind right now about how that situation could have been handled better, because there's certainly a number of things that could have been done to improve that whole interaction and scenario so that it was a better result and feeling for John and for Susie. And if you're unsure of what could be done to improve that scenario, there's a number of key feedback principles that are listed on page 9 for you to actually have a look at now, and I'll take you through, and just we can think about how that could apply back to this scenario at ABC Construction. So the first feedback principle is to provide feedback regularly. So do it regularly. In the example with Susie and John, if feedback is predominantly just given once a year, it's not enough. It's not going to be of benefit in an ongoing way, and in fact it will probably erode the relationship that you have with that staff member. It certainly won't lead to improved performance. So the key is to do it more regularly through the year. Ideally, weekly, fortnightly, monthly, depending on the size of your team and the interaction with your team. Doing it immediately is another key principle. So rather than building up a file, like in the example with Susie, when there is an issue that arises, and you feel it is something important enough to mention, make sure you do book in some time to talk to an employee about it. And the more that you do that, so the frequency and the more immediately you do it, the easier it actually gets to do. And the more you develop a relationship with your team member or your peer, depending on who it is, and the more they are able to receive that feedback from you. Another key feedback principle is to be as specific and clear as you possibly can be in the feedback that you're giving, rather than making general statements. So for example, with the situation with John and Susie, let's say that John has been late quite consistently. If Susie just says broadly to him, you're consistently late, that's not as specific as saying, in the last fortnight, on 3 shifts, you arrived 5 minutes late, 7 minutes late, and then 10 minutes late on a third day. And so that's really nailing down the behavior that you're trying to change and that you're pinpointing. Certainly making sure that you're not in a highly emotional space when you're giving the feedback. So if you're angry or frustrated with something that's happened, that's human and normal. But make sure you process that emotion and get to the point that you can talk about the specifics as opposed to about the emotion around it. Watch where you say what you need to say. So this is another feedback principle. Just choose the setting well. We've all made the mistake of having what should probably be a private conversation in front of other team members, and of course we know that that's not productive and it's not respectful either. So make sure you take the time to have the conversation where you won't be interrupted or overheard, and it might even involve going outside or off-site or having a coffee if you can do that at your workplace. But just make sure that it's in a place where you won't be interrupted or overheard. Another key feedback principle is to be positive before negative. So don't just concentrate on what went wrong. Certainly say what you need to say. So in that example about the lateness and the specific example, say that. But then focus on what can be done to improve the situation. Don't dwell on what's wrong, but look at solutions. So the person that you're speaking to, ask them, John, how can we improve on your punctuality? What's preventing you from getting to work on time, and what needs to happen to change that? What can you do? But certainly what can we do as an organization to accommodate that? Because you're moving the conversation into a more positive space. And last but not least, just be aware that practice makes perfect. It doesn't matter how many times you've had these kind of conversations with people where you've given feedback. They're never going to be easy, but practice does make perfect. And what I mean is the more you do it, the better you get at it, and the more willing you are to take the risk of having these kind of conversations, knowing that they never will be perfect, but you'll move to a place where you gain confidence around it. They'll also become more sincere and more natural. So those are just some key principles, and if you think about those principles and apply them back to John and Susie, if Susie had thought out her approach that she took with John and had more frequently given John feedback through the year, made sure it was an appropriate scenario, made sure she focused on solutions and ultimately the positives, for example, you can imagine that the scenario would have been completely different. Now on the last page, on page 10, we've just left you some space to make any notes about any comments that might resonate with you or any of the key principles, but particularly in relation to giving positive feedback. So when should you give positive feedback? And we've given you some space to note that down. And we've done this because it's important that when you give positive feedback, it is genuine, it is real. It's not just for the sake of saying something nice to someone because you know it's important. It's saying something that's genuinely positive that you've witnessed in that person and their behavior. So, John, I really appreciate that you are making an effort to get to work on time and that you actually haven't been late for the last fortnight. That's a really specific example. And doing that consistently. So I want you to think about right now when you can give positive feedback to those key people you mentioned. And the other area we just wanted you to be able to make some notes on, if you like, is when not to give feedback. So when you're in a highly emotional state is not a good time to give feedback. That's a good time to manage your emotion and let it vent, work it through, and then clarify what you're going to say and the timing of it. When not to give feedback, not in public, definitely not in front of other people, in a more private space and more appropriately. And there may be other principles that resonate with you here. But just take a moment now to pause and fill out anything in these blanks that you think is important for you to remember about feedback moving forward. We're now going to take some time to work through steps for giving constructive feedback. And in order to get the most benefit out of this process that we're going to go through, it's really important that you have a scenario that you choose to apply these 6 steps to. So a scenario at work where you know that you need to give some constructive feedback, and it can be to anyone, but ideally someone who's in the top 3 relationships you listed previously. So again, it might be a supervisor, it might be a peer, it might be a member of your team, but I'd like you to select a scenario now where you know that there's a need for some constructive feedback. And using that scenario to work through, we're moving through page 11 to 14, and you can note things down as we go, and then I'll give you a bit of time once I've taken you through those sheets to note down anything further that you may wish to. But using the scenario now in your head, the first step, and it's a very important step, is to state the constructive purpose of your feedback. So what is the reason that you need to give this feedback and feel compelled to give the feedback? And this is just checking your intention and making sure that the reason for doing this is right and aligned with your role and with the organization. So example statements that could start this off are things like, I have a concern about, or I feel I need to let you know, I want to discuss, or I have some thoughts about. So just decide now what might work for you there with the scenario that you got in your head, and note that down. And then we'll move on to step 2. And the second step in this process for constructive feedback is to describe specifically what you've observed. So one of the key principles of feedback we looked at earlier was about being specific. So, for example, you can say something as specific as yesterday afternoon, so the timing, when you were speaking with Joe, I noticed that you kept raising your voice. We'll now move to step 3 and continuing to think about how this applies to your scenario in your head. Step 3 is about describing your reactions. And in this step, you're explaining the consequences of the other person's behavior and how you feel about it. So you're helping that other person build up a self-awareness of the impact that they've had on you and other people as a result of their behavior. So for example, the staff member looked embarrassed and I felt uncomfortable about seeing the episode. Or shouting at a colleague is not acceptable behavior in this organization. So again, bring that back to your scenario. And then step 4 we'll move to, which is giving the other person an opportunity to respond. And a critical step, because giving the other person an opportunity to respond means we actually listen and give them space and time to say what they need to say and acknowledge that there might be some emotion in that for them. So remaining silent, meeting the other person's eyes, or having eye contact, and just letting them have the space that they need to respond. And you might, if they don't speak, if they don't answer or say anything, you might need to prompt them. So ways you can do that is asking them, so what do you think about this? Or what is your view of this situation? Tell me, what are your thoughts? So open-ended questions to draw them out. So again, thinking about how that applies to your scenario that you have in your head. And then we'll move to step 5, which is about offering specific suggestions. So this is moving to a solutions-based approach, moving into the positive space. So it's about being as helpful and supportive as you can. And if your intention is right in the first place of providing this constructive feedback, your intention will be about improving the situation. So this step will almost come naturally to you. So examples of how you can do this. Jennifer, I sometimes write myself notes and put up signs to remind myself to do something. You know, that's just an example or a way that you have used potentially to change behavior, to improve what you're doing. Or another example could be, Jill, rather than telling Ed that you're not interested in all the details, you might try asking him specific questions about the information that you're most interested in. So again, just finding another way to deal with that situation and supporting the person you're talking to about that. And then step 6, and this is the closing step, it's about summarizing and expressing your support. So reviewing the major points that you discussed and agreed on, summarize any action items, but again, keeping to the positive, not looking so much at the negative or the behavior, but action items or agreed ways forward that you've come up with. And for example, you can, something like, as I said, the way the group has figured out how to cover phone calls has really lessened the number of phone messages to be returned. You've really followed through on a tough problem. Please keep taking the initiative on problems like that. So that was quite clear and very positive. So by summarizing, you can avoid misunderstandings, and you can check in to make sure that things have been communicated clearly. Sometimes the person you're speaking to when you summarize will have a completely different take on it, and that's why it's so important that you do summarize and check in that their take on it is the same. And if it's different, give them the space to reveal that. And then something that you can finish off with, for example, is at least we understand each other better since we've talked. I'll do what I can to make sure your priorities are factored into the schedule. And let's also be honest that sometimes the process of giving constructive feedback won't end in this way. It may not end well. And the key is that you as a supervisor and leader acknowledge the importance of sorting the issue out and saying something like the timing now may not be right. There's a lot of emotion in the room. Why don't we pause and have a break and come back and look at this tomorrow or another time, so that that person knows that you're going to continue the conversation, but you're being respectful and giving them the space that they may need just to recover and process. Okay, now that we've taken some time to look at what words you can use and how you can approach giving constructive feedback, I want to look at the flip side. I want to look at how you can receive feedback and constructive criticism. And keeping in mind that it's absolutely critical as a supervisor that you're able to role model the receiving of feedback and constructive criticism. If you want to be giving it regularly, and if you recognize the importance of doing that, you need to actually demonstrate that you can receive that feedback. And that's probably one of the most powerful ways you can ensure that those conversations happen more readily. So I just want to go through some tips to help you receive feedback. So firstly, it's really important to be aware that people will approach you and give you feedback, and to actually encourage them to do that. And when they are, just stop and recognize that they want to say something to you, because you can often get a gut feel when people approach you that they want to give you some feedback about something. And the first step is to do your best to really, really listen. And this is a great way to buffer the feedback, because you don't have to think about what to say, you don't need to respond, you just need to listen. Listen to the point of understanding. So, don't interrupt, ask questions if you need to understand more about what's being said, but ideally listen to really hear what they're trying to say to you. Ask questions and paraphrase. So, check in, the issue that you're raising with me, or the behavior that you're seeing that you're unhappy with is X, Y, and Z. And that's a way of giving them, paraphrasing back what you're hearing from them and checking that you're on track in terms of what you're hearing, or finding out that you may not be, and giving them the opportunity to rephrase it so that you do actually fully hear what they're saying. Ask for time to think about the feedback, particularly if you're feeling emotional about it. You'll know if you're getting angry or defensive, or if you're shutting down. So having that awareness that you're doing that is a good time to say, okay, really appreciate you giving me the feedback. I just need some time to process it, and I'd like to then come back to this conversation. You can also ask to see any relevant policy if you feel that's necessary. So the issues raised with you around behavior that you may have exhibited could be in relation to a policy, so you may ask to see the irrelevant policy so you can get your head around that. A mindset that you can choose to take when you're receiving feedback is to see it as a learning experience. Often we don't get told the things that are the way that our behavior is impacting on other people negatively, and to learn those things is one of the best ways to actually change our behavior and to change the impact that we make. So see it as a learning experience. Try not to take it personally, and this is difficult, we're human, but it's not about you as a person, it's about your behavior and approach at work, or a particular thing that you've done at work, and it's about how you can modify and change that to improve that. And a great way to look at this is to say to yourself, I am not my work, so you are a person far beyond the job that you're actually doing, and if you look at yourself in that way, it can be easier to take on board the feedback. Know who else you can speak to. So you might wish to debrief and download with a trusted peer or colleague to help you understand better what's going on, or to get someone else's point of view on their perception on you and on the particular behavior that's being raised. And last but not least, I just want to talk about being defensive. And being defensive is obviously not a helpful response. We are human beings though, and when we take things personally or when we feel like we're being attacked, even if we're not, we can be defensive. And so knowing that you're being defensive is really important, and avoiding that, so avoiding taking things personally, avoiding reacting aggressively to things, and that's through self-awareness that you'll be able to do this. Avoid an adversarial relationship with the person when they're giving you feedback, and so that's meaning that if someone comes and gives you feedback about your behavior, that you defend and fight back and have an argument with them. Avoid that dynamic, and you can avoid that by listening rather than speaking in the first instance. You can avoid that by taking some time if you need to go away and come back when you're not feeling defensive. And if you look at it as an opportunity to learn and really hear what this person wants to say to you. So that's the list of tips that you can apply to receiving feedback, and hopefully that was useful for you. Hi, and welcome back. We're now going to spend some time looking at difficult conversations and how you can build your skill set in this space. I'd particularly like you to refer to pages 16 to 19 in your workbook for this section on difficult conversations. So wherever people are working together, there will always be sticky issues to deal with. And it's usually difficult conversations that are the way to address those sticky issues. As a supervisor, someone who leads a team of people, you need tools and techniques that will help you become more skillful in difficult conversations and turn these sticky issues into a positive outcome. Mastering difficult conversations will actually set you apart as a supervisor, so it will give you an edge. The techniques covered in this guide will help you to develop the tools to address uncomfortable issues in a timely and constructive manner. Turn potentially negative situations into positives by reframing and recreating positive action plans, as well as continually improve your interpersonal communication skills. So difficult conversations are just that. They're difficult, but often the most challenging things are also the most rewarding. By becoming skilled at having difficult conversations, you will increase your impact as a supervisor. You will deepen the relationship you have with your team, and you will create positive change throughout your organization. So there's lots of great reasons to increase your skill in the space of difficult conversations. I'd like you to turn to page 17 now, and there's an exercise there on assertive communication. And imagine that this is a scenario for you at Metro where you observe a colleague who's not following Metro procedure as it currently stands, or as you understand it to be. This isn't the first time you've observed this lack of procedural follow-through. You've noticed this individual doing the same thing before. Now there's 4 choices here that you can choose from, and either read through them yourself or listen to them and decide which would be your typical response to this kind of scenario. So you respond by either A, pretending you didn't notice, or B, pretending you didn't notice but recording the information on their file. Or C, approaching him and telling him you've had enough, what he's doing is wrong, and he needs to cut it out. Or D, approaching him and saying that you think what you're seeing breaches procedure, that it concerns you, and asking him if he's familiar with the procedure in question. So just take a moment to decide which one of those A, B, C, or D options would be what you would normally pick. So now that you've selected your response to that assertive communication exercise, just pay attention to page 18 and just note down if you took A, B, C, or D. And there's obviously 4 different types of communications listed there, and ideally you've fallen into D, which is assertive communication, which is the ideal form of communication in terms of building relationships and improving your communication generally. But accept that we are all human, and at any point in our lives we would have been passive, aggressive, and we would also have been aggressive as well as assertive. The key is that you understand what your default might be, so when you're feeling most uncomfortable or most emotional or most threatened, you may fall more consistently into the passive or the aggressive space. and it's just good to be aware of what that is. If you look at the table there of the 4 types of communication, and you note assertive communication, which is the desired area, that's about I win, you win. So when I say that that's going to lead to positive relationship results, that's because you're both working on a win-win. Whereas if you look at the other styles of communication, they typically lead to both of you losing, or at least one of you losing, which is actually not bridging any gap or building your relationship. And lastly, I just want to draw your attention to the bottom of the page. And your tone is a very important part of your communication. And sometimes we don't realize how important that is. Our words may only have 10-20% impact in terms of what we're trying to communicate. So our word choice is definitely important, but it's not the most important thing. Our tone is actually far more important in terms of the impact we make in the communication and how people perceive us. So to become more aware of our tone and to choose the right tone, a tone that's not going to inflame or certainly not be attacking, can make a huge difference in your communication. An assertive tone is firm, but it's not aggressive and it's not passive. So just being aware of what your tone is can be really useful. And so now let's move to page 19. And you'll see that there's a table there that outlines a fair bit of detail in terms of body language and voice and the words that you can use in your communication. And pay particular attention to the assertive style of communication, the I win, you win that we just looked at. And what happens with body language is that if you have the eye-to-eye contact and you keep level, ideally you're both standing or sitting as opposed to one sitting and the other standing. You have an open posture, so the way that I'm starting to hold myself now, you open yourself up, you're upright, your feet are solidly planted if you're standing or even if you're in a chair. In terms of your voice, there's a firmness in the tone of the voice, but it's not loud or yelling. It's clear and audible, and there's a reasonable tone. And the kind of tone that I'm demonstrating to you right now will fall into that category of being assertive. And then last but not least, the words that you choose. So sticking to the point, making your point rationally, using I statements, which demonstrates that you're taking responsibility for your response and reaction to things and is less attacking and threatening. And taking responsibility for yourself too, thinking about how you've impacted on the particular scenario you're communicating on or how you could improve it. So now have a look at page 20, and we're going to go into a bit more depth around assertive communication. And assertive communication is 3 things. First and foremost, it's positive. It's win-win, as we've mentioned. It focuses on finding a solution as distinct to laying blame. Secondly, it's confident. To be assertive, you must be confident in what you think, what you feel, and what you want. And you get that level of confidence and clarity by preparing for an assertive conversation. And thirdly, assertive communication is accountable. You must take ownership over your part in the conflict. You must own your thoughts, feelings, and actions, and therefore use the I language that we looked at before. That demonstrates that you're taking responsibility and ownership for your part in the communication. Keep in mind that no one can make you feel a certain way. We often hear people say that, you made me feel this way, and we've all done it ourselves, myself included. But in fact, how you react is your choice, and keeping this in the forefront of your mind means that you can actually manage your reaction better, and you own your own emotions. So now if you turn to page 21, there's an assertive communication template here that you can use as your step-by-step guide for any assertive communication that you are now going to plan out and take action with. There's a couple of examples on the page that I'll take you through. So one example involves being interrupted by a team member when you're trying to speak. And so using this template in terms of how you can step out the words, you can say something like, when we end up talking at the same time, I feel like you don't value what I have to say. And what I would like to do about it is give you the time to talk before or after me, so that when it's my turn, you don't need to interrupt me to have you say. How does that sound to you? And just think about how that felt as I read that to you, how that assertive communication felt. And I would imagine that you would have found that reasonably easy to embrace and consider. Another example is a team member who brushes you off. So something you can say here is, sometimes when I try to talk to you, it seems like you're too busy, or I don't have the time to listen to me. When that happens, I feel frustrated and like my ideas are not getting heard. What I'd like to do is book in a time to talk when we won't be distracted by other people and things so that you can hear what I have to say. How does that sound to you? So again, just another example for you to use. Keeping this template available, it's something that you can actually start to implement right away if you like, with conversations that you know you need to have. But you can also use it with your coach, following on from this video, the module, to work through a difficult conversation that you're preparing for. As well, on page 22, there's more space there for you to start recording these kinds of conversations. So 22 in particular, you can work through with your coach. Now let's turn to page 23 and spend a bit of time looking at the concept of active listening. So think about someone that you consider to be a good listener. And think about the last time you had a conversation with this person. What did they do that makes you think that they're a good listener? Is it their body position? Is it their eye contact? Is it how they respond to what you're saying? Or is it just a combination of non-verbal and verbal language? Developing active listening skills is a huge step towards building relationships with your colleagues. So those 3 primary relationships that you identified earlier in this module, it's absolutely critical that you practice active listening with those people. Active listening can help you clarify and understand the messages that are being sent to you. At first it may seem artificial to use these skills, but the more you incorporate them into your everyday conversations, the more you practice them, the more comfortable you'll become utilizing them. So let's now look at some specific skills to apply for active listening on page 24 and 25. And the first is around offering support. So indicating to your team that you're there to listen and to try and help them work through their concerns, and be more productive and get more out of their work is a really positive step to take with them. Making time for your team is an important message in itself and indicates that you're supportive of them. You need to establish clear expectations as to the appropriate time and place for conversations. So for example, you aren't really going to be able to give your full attention to a complex conversation if you're having it in the lunchroom with other people around, but it might be appropriate to have an informal conversation there. Ensure that you have time to finish the conversation if need be, so schedule the conversation in advance. And rather than waiting for an opportunity when you pass them in the hallway, you'll then have it locked in and you'll know that it's actually going to happen. And you may need to schedule in a follow-on conversation if you don't finish it in the time allocated. If someone attempts to start a conversation, which you know you need to spend more than 5 minutes on, make sure you indicate your interest, explain why now is not a good time to have that conversation, and then settle on a better time to meet. So that's a very important process to go through to send a message that you actually do care about the conversation that that person wants to have with you. Secondly, let that person or let them decide the direction. So avoid getting too specific too soon. Listen to really hear what it is that they're trying to say to you. You can start with broad statements that allow the other person the opportunity to begin focusing on the issues and to begin defining the problems. So for example, you can say something like, tell me a bit about what happened yesterday, or how are things going? Subtle differences in the way you start the conversation can create either a sense of openness or a lack of interest. Thirdly, let's look at this concept of reflecting. So reflecting is a technique where you restate key points from the conversation back to the sender in order to gain clarity around what they're trying to tell you. So it's a way of checking in. So this will enhance your understanding of the message they're trying to send you. And it gives the sender the opportunity to reflect on your understanding and modify it if necessary. So you get a clear sense of what the issue is. Take 2 or 3 key phrases from the previous statement that the person has said and say them back to the sender. Rather than stating exactly what has been said, tell your colleague what you have understood the underlying key message to be. And that's how you go through that process of reflecting. Clarifying is another process, so seek clarification to gain understanding of the information being sent to you. So when you become confused about what you're being told, politely stop the speaker and ask for clarification. Admitting confusion might feel difficult, but if you don't get clarification, the confusion will escalate. Admitting that confusion is also a sign of respect and showing that you are trying to actively listen. Silence is an important concept too, and human beings have an uncanny ability to feel awkward in a silent room, and we have an incredible need to fill in the gap when others aren't talking by just speaking for the sake of it. Only when people are extremely comfortable with each other are they happy to sit together in silence. So use silence to your advantage and avoid speaking just because no one else is. Remaining silent when you have nothing to say gives both parties time to think and reflect on what is being said. And last but not least, summarizing. So attempt to end each conversation with a summary of what has taken place and the actions to be taken. This allows both individuals a chance to hear the key points and to agree about what was said, or to disagree and then revise the content. It highlights what actions are to be taken and by whom, thereby avoiding misunderstanding about what was decided and the next steps to be taken. So that brings us to a close in terms of the communication module. So thanks for your work done this far. The next step is that you'll be assigned to work with a coach one-on-one, and you'll have an appointment booked in with you shortly. Make sure that you bring the handbook to your coaching session so you can show your coach the relationship planning information as well as the difficult conversation planning information. And you may or may not have some content in there already, and either is fine. You'll also be able to talk through with your coach about your strengths in terms of communication and the areas that you may particularly wish to work on and improve outside of perhaps some areas that have been identified in this module. After you've met with your coach, you'll have an opportunity to put some actions into place in the workplace and to review those actions. You'll then come back and see your coach again. And prior to that second session with your coach, you're going to go through another self-assessment and just see if there's any changes for you in that assessment. And then you'll identify those changes with your coach. You'll talk about the result of your actions that you've implemented, and you'll continue to work through your communication strategies. So all the best with the communication, and I look forward to catching up with you on site.